Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. history class. This is part of our Industrial Revolution Notes series. This one looks at From Rags to Riches, Captains of Industry or Robber Barons. The video lecture for this comes to us from the textbook on pages 619 to 622, titled Big Business. The guiding questions today are, why do some refer to this period in history between 1870 and 1900 as the Gilded Age? What does laissez faire mean? And then who were the three leading men in business during this time, and what industries did they mostly control? So let's look here at this first one. What is meant by the term the Gilded Age? This is actually a term that was coined by none other than Mark Twain. The Gilded Age is a term oftentimes used to describe this period because of the vast differences between the super wealthy and the very, very poor. Many Americans in the later part of the 1800s after the Civil War are going to become super wealthy, instant millionaires, and many of them were self-made men, meaning that they started out with very little themselves and through hard work and tenacity are going to become very, very wealthy individuals. But at the same time in American history, right below the surface, you have a lot of Americans living in tremendous amounts of poverty. You have on the left-hand side here two images of two structures of around the same time period. On the top, you have here of the Vanderbilt mansion, a beautiful mansion of one of the wealthiest families in the United States who gained a lot of their money from railroads. And here below, you have a shack in an alley in the crowded street of New York. So you have this extreme differences between the very, very wealthy and the very, very poor in the United States. Corruption was also a huge problem in politics. A lot of people felt, especially the poor and middle class, that they weren't getting necessarily as an equal as a say in American politics. And so the idea of being gilded means that on the surface it looks really nice and shiny and brand new, which if you looked at this time period and looked at people like the Vanderbilts, it's nice and shiny, it's bright, very wealthy, lots of wealth. But if you peel away the surface and the layers and get down to the core, there's some major problems there. It's cheap. It's not necessarily going to withstand that quality. And that's why this term, the Gilded Age, was kind of coined, that on the surface, America looks to be doing very well economically by looking at these millionaires, but below the surface, there's some problems with a lot of the middle class and the poor, as we're going to examine here. The laissez-faire is a French term. It basically means when a government does not interfere in that nation's economy. It literally means hands off, right? It means very little government regulations or attempts to control companies, businesses, and industries. The big dilemma that America was facing, along with many other countries during this time period, was that were experiencing the Industrial Revolution, was what should be the role of the government in regulating and controlling that business. And really, ever since the Industrial Revolution, we as a country have had that debate and kind of gone back and forth over to a more of a laissez-faire, hands-off, government shouldn't have anything to do with business, to more direct regulations and control on business. A good modern-day example of this is the current debate about healthcare. Healthcare, when it was passed back in 2000, the mid-2000s, you had the two major American political parties having a very different view on how healthcare should operate and how businesses should be operated as well. Republicans tend to be very much of a laissez-faire political party. They feel that government, by intruding on businesses, can do more harm than good. And it might be better for government to take more of a laissez-faire approach, where Democrats typically believe that without any oversight, businesses can become too big, too powerful, too corrupt, that there should be kind of a regulating hand on businesses and corporations so that they're fair to consumers and they're fair to their workers and fair to their employers. So you have two different opinions on how those two kind of operate. So we think about today in the news, a lot of times Republicans are less likely to pass regulations over businesses or sectors of the economy. They want the free market to kind of determine the winners and losers in the market system, where Democrats typically tend to be a little more hands-on. And we saw that in the debate with health care a few years ago, where the GOP, the Republican Party, was very much no need for the government to step in. They want free markets to open up opportunities for healthcare opportunities. Government shouldn't play a role in determining a person's health care. where the Democrats were a little bit more of, well, there's so many people who are without health care, there needs to be something done to help those who are in need. And so as we look at this one issue of health care, you see these two very different positions. And that's true in banking regulations and government regulations. Typically, Republicans are more the laissez-faire political party. They don't think there should be they're more hands-off. There shouldn't be a lot of government interactions, where the Democrats tend to be a little bit more interested in regulations in the government. So during this Gilded Age, we were very laissez-faire. So this would be very true to Republican principles. There was very little interference with big business and government, and because of that, businesses really did grow rapidly, and the owners of many of these businesses become very, very wealthy as a result. There are three main business leaders that kind of emerge out of this industrial revolution, this Gilded Age, and they are Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. And so we're going to talk about these three gentlemen now. Andrew Carnegie was the Scottish immigrant who came to Europe and learned about this new process called the Bessemer process to produce steel cheaper and more efficiently. He brings this technology back to the United States, and pretty soon he becomes the owner of one of the most powerful companies in America, the Carnegie Steel Company. He was a pretty shrewd businessman. He would buy up his rival companies because they couldn't compete with them. He was able to lower the price of steel so much that the other companies who just didn't have this Bessemer process figured out yet, couldn't compete with him. So he would drop the price of steel down, and the companies, his rivals, couldn't compete, and then he would buy them, and then just grow his businesses that way. By the time he gets to the peak of his power, he basically controls about a fourth of all the nation's steel produced in the United States. Now, he grows extremely wealthy, and as a result, he does give tremendous amounts of money away to charity. He is believed to give almost away about $350 million to different charity organizations. The Carnegie Institute, which is still around today, still is giving out endowments and charities to people around the country. So he was a very smart businessman and very shrewd businessman, but he also believed in giving back to people in charity formation, and actually encourage other millionaires like him to give back to charity, which some do. John D. Rockefeller will become the oil guy. He will end up controlling about 95% of all the nation's oil refining in the United States by 1880. He will create what's called the Standard Oil Trust. This is going to streamline the oil industry. It's going to make it more efficient, where he will be able to control this production of oil from the time it pulls from the ground to the time it's refined into a usable product like gasoline. But he will monopolize and basically control most of the oil refinement of the country. 95% is what he controls. Like Carnegie, he will also give away money to charity. He will give about $500 million in charity. You may have heard of a place called Rockefeller Center in New York, named after him. He will become a very wealthy and powerful magnate over this time period, and like Carnegie, will give away millions of dollars. Carnegie and Rockefeller, an easy way to remember the difference between the two. If you think about where you find oil, you find that underground, and rocks are in the ground, and so Rockefeller, oil. Carnegie is the steel guy. So Rockefeller, just remember rocks, oil, ground. That should help you remember the steel guy. J.P. Morgan is our third and final major business leader. J.P. Morgan was a banker. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States during this time period, the late 1800s. In fact, he was so wealthy that he will end up buying Carnegie steel factories from him for about $880 million, which is this first billion-dollar corporation ever founded. J.P. Morgan was very, very wealthy. He was coming from a very wealthy family of bankers, which makes him a little bit different than maybe Carnegie and Rockefeller, where he already came from a great deal of wealth. He will eventually own most of the railroads and banks in the United States, which again makes him a very powerful, wealthy individual. But like Carnegie and Rockefeller, he did donate money to philanthropic causes. In large part, he was a huge art collector, loved very expensive art, and he donated to the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York. So he also was a very, very wealthy businessman, but at the same time believed very strongly in giving back to his community. So these are some of the major business leaders of the 1800s, early 1900s, these captains of industry, very shrewd businessmen, and were kind of ability to grow and expand like they were because there was this laissez, faire philosophy that there was very little regulations over their businesses, so they could do a lot to kind of consolidate their power in their respective industries. In the next lecture video series, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these business tactics that they will use. Thank you for listening.